Okay, we're on page 5 of 8. Our pens and pads here if anybody wants. Okay, good morning, everybody. I feel like last week we got a little deep, maybe too deep. Yes?
Yes.
So I'm going to try. Welcome. Are you here for the Israeli program? You're here for the Israeli program? Follow the hallway all the way down to the other end of the building. You're welcome. All right. So I'm going to try to recap what we learned so far in this discourse and focus on 2 points. And if I do a good job at explaining it, then when I read through the text, it'll go much more smoothly. First of all, Lachem. Do you need a spot? You need a copy? Yeah, take this one. This is the second one. Should have enough to go around. If you have an extra copy around, or if you can share, please do that. I think that's it. You know, I'm going to print some and take them off the printer. Can you do that? Okay, give me a few minutes. I'm going to have. No, you can take that one. I don't need a copy. You can take that. Just give me a second here. We're going to have.
You're sitting on your hat as well.
Can you make sure the French staples? Yeah.
Okay.
Why do you have this question?
Oh.
Really?
I love technology when it works.
Yes.
I'm going to do a staple, yeah. Layout, finishing options, 1 staple on the left. We'll print 10 copies and wait till they're all printed and then bring them up, okay?
Okay. I'll wait here for a second.
Okay. All right. So the discourse is based on the verse. Welcome. You can grab it, keep it in the basket there, or else in the top drawer. And right outside over there. Yep. And Payman, if you can help, maybe put a second chair over there so everybody's comfortable.
Are they here for this program? What's going on downstairs?
We'll find out soon.
What's going on
Find out
downstairs?
soon.
I know.
There's a Israeli educational forum with Dr. Ken Stein. Anyway, come. There's some seats over there.
Sounds good.
Okay,
That's what I was just gonna do.
here we go. So the Torah tells us that after the first day of Pesach, we count 7 days, 7 times, or 7 weeks, which we actually read about leading up to the revelation at Mount Sinai, which we read about in this week's Parsha Yisro. And there are, although the counting is associated with the mitzvah of the Omer offering, which was brought on the 2nd day of Pesach, culminating on the 50th day with the offering of Shavuos, the offering of the 2 loaves of bread and the sheep and so on. But there's the on a very practical level, when the Jewish people left Egypt, they actually counted 50 days until they arrived at Mount Sinai. And even now, after the temple is no longer, the mitzvah, the commandment to count every day continues to be in place. And so there's a deeper understanding that this mitzvah is not only associated with the Omer offering, but it's also, and perhaps even more so, related with the idea of preparation, preparing for the revelation at Sinai. That means that we were in Egypt. And when we were in Egypt, we were at a spiritual low. And God took us out of Egypt, and we began a process of preparing ourselves for the revelation at Sinai. In other words, we worked our way, we worked through our character, refining our character until we arrived to the revelation at Sinai, when we were worthy, so to speak, of receiving the Torah. So that's the mitzvah. Usefartem Lachem, you shall count for yourself, and so on. The Alter Rebbe tells us that the nature of all of existence is that everything has a pulsing reality to it. Any doctors in the room? Barry? We have one doctor. Anybody been to the doctor? Right? They take your pulse, they take your blood pressure, and as long as something's going on in there, it may not be good, but it's not bad, right? As long as this is true, but we're going to stay. But as long as something's going on in there, we have something to work with. When there's no movement, we're in trouble. In other words, being alive means there's a pulsating reality to it. What does it mean that something is pulsing? It means that there's a to and fro. There's movement towards something, and there's a return from something. In the heart, it's called the systolic and the diastolic. Diastolic. Systolic and diastolic. But what shows up in the heart is actually a reflection of what's going on in all of existence. From the very beginning of creation, from the very first divine revelation, we already have this pulsating. Why? Because the definition of existence is I exist. There's me. But do I really exist? What is my existence made up of? My existence is made up of divine energy. So then I don't really exist. God exists. But wait, I feel myself. I'm hungry. I'm tired. I have desires. I have things I want to accomplish. Okay, so I do exist. But wait, what's the true identity of my existence? It's divine energy. So then I don't exist. So there's this natural tug and pull that goes on in the very fabric of existence. And it manifests itself even when consciously or subconsciously we're divorced from that thought process, because it may be that you just thought of that thought process for the first time in your entire life, but that exists inherently within each of us. For example, most good people, and I'd like to think that most people are good, would like to live a life of meaning and purpose. Now, what they define as meaning and purpose, it covers the gamut. It could be from saving the whales, to saving humanity, to saving the trees, to just being a good husband or a good wife or a good parent, to teaching Torah, to serving God. I mean, the gamut, each one of us in this room has things that we wish to accomplish, things that we define ourselves, define being a successful human being by. But all of those require a movement towards something. And in reality, we never achieve fully that goal. Because if we achieve that goal fully, we would then be done, right? So we achieve one goal, and then perhaps we say, okay, well, I achieved one level of it, I want to achieve more. Let's say, let's use business as an example. The Talmud says that Mishi Eshleimana writes the Messiah, the one who has 100 wants 200, right? So what happens when you have 200? What's next? So the Talmud doesn't say 300. It says Mishi Eshleim Messiah writes the Arba Meas. You want 400, right? Because we don't. If only we were able to contain ourselves in a gradual growth, but that's not the reality of who we are. I mean, some people maybe actually have that level of discipline, but we want more and we want more and we want more. So if that's true when it comes to money, oftentimes it's true when it comes to spiritual pursuit as well.
How many days out towards Sinai was the golden calf?
It was after Sinai, 40 days after Sinai. Thank you, Henya. Anybody needs a copy? We've got some here. Let's pass them down either side here. Okay, so So there's this movement that's built into the fabric of creation. There's this movement that's built into the human consciousness, which is we run towards something. And when we achieve it, we somewhat retreat, we somewhat relax, but then we move again towards the next thing. Does this make sense? Does this resonate? This is the reality of the human condition. And again, it's the reality in the human condition because it is so in the spiritual dimension. Now, Pesach is a running away from, thank you, Charna. Pesach is running away, or we might even say running towards, right? When the Jewish people left Egypt, they were running away from the perversion and the unholiness and the impurity of Egypt towards Mount Sinai. What happened when they came to Mount Sinai, when they experienced the revelation at Sinai? It says, God descended on the mountain. Again, spiritually, that means that the revelation that they yearned for, they achieved. They received it. So you set the goal to run the marathon. You run the marathon, you're outputting. You finish the marathon, you relax, you rest. You take a step back, you enjoy your accomplishment. And then you schedule the next marathon, if you're that kind of person. But not everything has to be a marathon, right? Your business achieves a certain milestone, and then you sit back and you say, look what we accomplished, that's wonderful. What's our next goal? What's the next milestone? And so on and so forth. This is the nature of things. So when they left Egypt, they were running towards Mount Sinai. When they arrived at Mount Sinai, they received the revelation at Mount Sinai. So we can tie that in a bow a little bit, okay? That's one idea, kind of the fundamental idea that introduces this discourse. Now, this is not an event of the past. The exodus from Egypt and the revelation at Sinai are not events of the past, because the Talmud tells us, the Mishnah tells us that in every generation, we read this in the Haggadah every year on the eve of Passover, that in every generation, one is obligated to see themselves as if they themselves left Egypt. The Alter Rebbe, the author of this discourse, writes in the book of Tanya in chapter 47, he adds a word, not just in every generation, but in every generation and every day. Every day we have this responsibility, this obligation to see ourselves as if we are leaving Egypt. Now begs the question, I don't remember being in Egypt, and I don't feel any Egyptian taskmasters over me. So how can I possibly leave Egypt? The answer is that Egypt is much more than a place, just like denial is much more than a river. Egypt is much more, thank you, appreciate that. So too, Egypt is much more than a land. In Hebrew, Egypt is Mitzrayim. The word Mitzrayim is narrow places. On Rosh Hashanah, before we blow the shofar, we quote the verse, Min hametzar karasika, from the narrow places we call out to God. Anani b'merchavka, God responds from his expansiveness. Min hametzar, metzar, from the narrow space. Metzar is the root word of Mitzrayim. So narrow spaces is Egypt. What does it mean to be in a narrow space? Anybody have a suggestion what a narrow space is? Go ahead.
It's very hard to move forward or to the side or go back. It's very confined. It's like a prison.
So you're stuck in a space. Go ahead. Somebody there wanted to say something?
We need to find another place to farm.
Great. So narrow spaces obviously can literally mean a physical space. But when we think about exile, think about the greats who have been in exile. They weren't necessarily confined to a land. They weren't confined to a cell. They were restricted from being who they wanted to be. They were restricted from living their values. That's Egypt. And if we think about ourselves, each of us in our own lives, if I once, years ago, I was part of I hired a business coach. It was a kind of a combination coaching and course where the idea was to learn how to structure a business. But it was very fascinating because the beginning of the course was about identifying a personal mission statement. And one of the things that the coach did was ask me to write my obituary. Anybody ever do that? Try it. Write your own obituary. It's a very sobering thing to do. But what's fascinating about writing an obituary is that you come face to face with who you really are or who you really want to be. Right? When we say, this is what I want them to be saying about me, that means that that's who I really am. That's who I really want to be. And yet we spend our whole lives trying to achieve that, constantly bumping up against stuff, bumping up against our stuff. And our stuff could be, childhood stuff. It could be adult stuff. It could be insecurities. It could be all kinds of things. But all of those things that prevent us from being who we really want to be, those are our Egypts. Now, sometimes they're from within, and sometimes they legitimately are from without. Sometimes there are people in our lives or circumstances in our lives that restrict us. But we never are confined to Egypt unless we allow ourselves to be confined to Egypt. And how are we confined to Egypt? What compels us to stay in Egypt? What prevents us from leaving Egypt?
Fear.
Fear of what?
Fear of the unknown.
Fear of the unknown. What else?
Comfort.
Meaning we're comfortable where we are. So what prevents us from leaving Egypt, in a word, is ego. It's ourselves. Which means that we see the world as divorced from godliness. I'm not saying that fear is not real. In other words, that we're not legitimately afraid. But why don't we push through that fear? Why don't we break out of our comfort? Because there's a part of us that doesn't really believe that God is there holding our hand. Or that the circumstances that we're experiencing is really orchestrated from God. If you walk into a dark room and it's frightening and you could turn the light on, why don't you turn the light on? We have the ability to leave Egypt and turn the light on. That's what it means to leave Egypt, to turn the light on. Turning the light on means we get to see the godliness inside of ourselves and the godliness in the experiences around us, and understand that while that person may be difficult in my life, or that circumstances may be difficult in my life, I'm not limited to that. I am not subject to being in Egypt in that circumstance. And I have the capacity to navigate through it, over it, around it, whatever. And that's true externally. And of course, internally, that I am not limited by my own stuff. I mentioned this last week, that I find that I'm finishing up a book about the founder of AA, that you're talking about people who have one of the greatest challenges in life to experience addiction, whether it's alcohol or drugs or whatever it is. And the gold standard of recovery is belief in God, is anchoring in God, is surrendering to God. What does that mean? And ask anybody who's in recovery, they'll tell you how many times a day, a week, a month, a year, they have to stop and say, I'm not in control. God's in control. This is God's plan. There's a master plan at play here. So if I let go and let God, I can navigate through this. You don't have to be in recovery. You don't have to be in recovery to have an addiction, right? We're all addicted to our comfort, right? We're all addicted to our stuff that prevents us from moving forward. And the solution is bringing God into our consciousness. Just like when the Jewish people left Egypt, what happened? It says, and we read this in the Haggadah, God says, I took you out of Egypt. I am not a malach, not an angel, not a seraph. I myself took you out of Egypt. Which means, again, if we're stuck in Egypt and we anchor ourselves in God, we can get out of Egypt. We don't have to be stuck in Egypt. So again, What we're trying to do here is we're trying to leave Egypt to go to Mount Sinai. We're running towards Mount Sinai, but we're stuck in Egypt. But we have the capacity to break out of Egypt. How do we break out of Egypt? By bringing God into our consciousness. And now we're going to make it very practical. If we bring God into our consciousness, we begin to live with God, the odds are that we're going to be able to leave Egypt much more frequently than not. Now, I want to talk a little bit. So there's going to be 2 points I'm going to talk about today. One is bringing God into our consciousness. What does that mean? How do we get there? And the second, we'll get to the second soon. So bringing God into our consciousness, like any other discipline, like any other practice, requires work. Okay?
How do you define bringing God into consciousness?
Great question. I'll tell you what it means for me. It means for me that when something bubbles up inside of me, like we use the language today, when I get triggered, right? Everybody gets triggered today, right? We always got triggered, but now we have a trigger word for it. When I get triggered, my next thought after the emotional trigger is, how does God factor into this? That's a little cold, but it's not a bad place to be. But what I'd like to do is that when I'm getting triggered is to say, Hashem is here with me. I'm safe. I can navigate this. It's like a child who falls. If there's a healthy relationship with the parent, the child runs to the parent. Why? Because they know they're going to get comfort there. They're going to navigate through their stuff there. I want God to be in my consciousness that when something is not right inside of me, and that could be that I'm getting triggered. It could be that I have an unholy or unhealthy temptation. It could be a relationship that's bumping up against me. It could be that I just got a phone call that my stock price went down, or a loved one just went into the hospital, or there was a terrorist attack in Israel, or anything else that gets my blood pressure above its normal systolic and diastolic level, that my next thought is about God. That to me, for me, that's what it means that God is in my consciousness. Now, what I would love, but that belongs to the realm of the tzaddik. What I would love is that I never get triggered, because my filter, all of my emotions have a filter on it, which is godliness. But that's not really human. If you're a tzaddik, which there are very few in any generation, maybe you could be at such a place. But I want at least that when I get triggered, I should be able to have that responsiveness. Now, like any discipline, it doesn't happen on its own. Some of you may like to listen to podcasts, and you may have a certain area of podcasting that you like to listen to. You might like to listen to medicine. You might like to listen to business, art, music, whatever. There's endless. I don't even know how many millions of podcasts there are out there. You're not going to own the information just by listening to it. Maybe if you listen to hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours of a particular subject matter, some of it will trickle in a way that you'll own it. But for the most part, it's information. Information lives up here. You don't own what's in here. You own what's in here. Now, information is very important, but you don't own it when it's in your head. You own it when it's in your heart. How do you get it from your head to your heart? How do you get it from your head to your heart? Huh?
Discipline.
What discipline? Discipline of what? What do you do?
Work.
What did you say?
Action.
Okay.
Practice.
Pray. Thank you very much. Prayer. So prayer, I want to demystify prayer for a second. Let's use the context of prayer here as meditation. Okay? So we'll make it more universal. Meditation is the act of moving intellect and transforming it into emotion. the Alter Rebbe tells us something fascinating. The author of this discourse tells us something fascinating. If you look where the brain lives inside the head, which is, various degrees of narrowness. But hopefully everybody's head is far more narrow than their chest and their shoulders, right? The heart lives in this arena. So there's a narrowness in the head and there's an expansiveness in the chest. Or there's a narrowness in the intellect and there's an expansiveness in the heart. Between the head and the heart, there's a birth canal. And that's inside of our neck. We have the windpipe, we have the food pipe, right? Elsewhere, the Alter Rebbe tells us, he draws a parallel to the butler and the baker in the Joseph story, because every intellectual idea has, we need to introduce moisture, warmth. There needs to be a firing component for another time. But the idea is that from intellect to emotion, there's a birth canal. And just as in the analogy, giving birth to a child, giving birth to new life is an extremely difficult process. It takes time. There's contractions, which contractions is the same pulsating, right? There's opening and closing. There's a retreat and there's expansiveness. There's retreat and expansiveness, or I should say expansiveness and retreat, expansiveness and retreat. There's a process. Somebody there? Let's point, let somebody else. Payman, can you grab the front door, please?
I think people are coming up here
Yeah.
for the Israel program.
It should stop soon because it starts now. So, just as in childbirth, there's this expansiveness and retreat. So we also have that experience, which is really the function of meditation. We take in, we process, we take in, we process. It's an ongoing event. And it's not easy. Meditation is the process through which we move an idea from its disconnected, objective experience into a subjective, connected reality for us. This makes sense so far? Everybody with me? I see short shakings of heads. So prayer is really meditation. Prayer is meditation. And I'm emphasizing this because I don't want anybody to walk out of here, and unless you're here exclusively for the intellectual value, that's great. But I don't want anybody to walk out of here thinking that I heard a great class, it was beautiful ideas, but I'm not feeling it. You're not going to feel it. Even if you're feeling it right now, it's not real feelings. That's just your heart, your animal that's responding. It's a moment. We get excited for a moment when we hear a good idea, we hear good music, but it doesn't last. If we want it to last, we have to own it. And to own it, we have to invest ourselves in it. And specifically, we have to invest ourselves in the process of moving something from intellect into emotion. That's what prayer is. Now, I'm not discounting prayer itself, both because it's a practice, as somebody mentioned. I think maybe you mentioned practice. Somebody mentioned practice. Practice. What does that mean, a practice? A practice means it's something you do over and over again, right? It's a little frightening. You go to a doctor who's practicing medicine. Like, wait, when are you gonna finish practicing? In a sense, you don't ever want a doctor to finish practicing, right? When you stop practicing, then the ego kicks in. Oh, I know everything. I don't need to practice anymore, right? I want you to have the humility to say, I don't know everything. I'm going to ask somebody else if I get stuck. But it's a practice because it's a lifelong journey. We'll never get there. We can intensify, we can grow, we can become more familiar, we can invest ourselves, we can get into this relationship with God that becomes very real to us, but it's never going to be seamless because there's always a human being that has a physical consciousness. Okay, so again, to recap, to leave Egypt, to leave not to be limited by our stuff, not to be limited and triggered from world circumstances around us. We need to bring God into our consciousness. Bringing God into our consciousness is a function of prayer, i.e., a function of meditation. This is what prayer is all about. And this is the focus of the discourse now, is prayer. Now I'm going to build the ladder of prayer. In other words, I'm going to give you tools. I'm going to give you the process of meditation that the Alter Rebbe tells us here. I'm going to start with the end. The end is the Shema prayer, the apex of the morning service. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Right? That's the consciousness that you asked about. The consciousness is that the Lord is one, God is one, meaning at the end of the day, every aspect of life, every fragment of existence is permeated with divine consciousness. That's where I want to get to. I want to get to a place where my consciousness is, hear, O Israel, here meaning it's internalized, that Hashem is one. And what's the result of that? As we say in the next paragraph of the Shema, you shall love Hashem your God with all your hearts, with all your soul, with all your might, all your hearts. The Talmud says your godly soul, your good inclination, and your evil inclination. Or in Hasidic terminology, your godly soul and your animal soul. In other words, if I bring God into my consciousness, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the Lord is one. If I bring that into my consciousness, then the result of that is that permeates me, not just on my godly level, but also on my animal level. Meaning the part of me that gets triggered brings a love for God into that experience, that I don't have to fall apart. I don't have to act on the trigger. I can calm myself down. I can take a deep breath and get myself anchored. But that's the high point of prayer. How do we get there? We got to climb to there. And I use the term climb because we have the famous story in the Torah where Jacob goes to sleep and he has a dream, and in the dream he sees angels going up and angels going down. And the oft asked question is, why are angels come from heaven? So why are they coming down first and then going up? They should be going up. Why aren't they coming down first and then going up? They're going up and then coming down. So it says it's a metaphor. There's a technical answer in the Midrash, but the spiritual answer is that Jacob's dream is a metaphor for prayer. And what happens is prayer begins with us. We have a movement upwards, and then we have the response from God. That's the journey. So prayer is a ladder. So what's the ladder of prayer? So prayer has, for the purposes of today's conversation, 3 sections. We have what's known as the Psuke de Zimra, the verses of song. The subject matter there is the wonder of nature and the miracles that God performed for the Jewish people. The second section, which is the blessings of the Shema, talk about the spiritual cosmos, the cosmos and the spiritual cosmos. We actually already begin to talk about the cosmos in the verses of song, but in the blessings of the Shema, we move into the spiritual cosmos. And then the apex, proclaiming Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, that God is one. Now, how does this serve as the ladder? So here's where we have to have a lot of compassion for the animal soul, i.e. for ourselves. We are souls in a body. So when you get triggered, don't get angry at yourself, because you're not a soul alone. If you were just the soul, then you say, what's this business? I'm getting triggered. Souls don't get triggered. Bodies get triggered. But God put your soul in your body, so you get triggered. God has an agenda, by the way, in you getting triggered, and that is for you to bring him into your consciousness. As long as you don't act on your trigger, that's a good starting point. It's not the end game, but it's a good starting point. The goal is to help diffuse the trigger over time. But because we have a body, we got to speak to the body. You don't need to convince the soul that God is real. You don't need to convince the soul that God is present. The soul is not struggling with that. The body's struggling with that. So we got to get the body excited. How do we get the body excited? So we start by saying that every blade of grass is nurtured by God. That in the spring, the flowers blossom. That tonight is Tu B'Shvat, and there's an annual cycle that God implanted in the structure. That you plant a seed in the ground, and it grows into a tree, and you nurture it, and you plant those fruit, the seeds from those fruit, and it grows into another tree. And the winds blow, and the rains fall in their season. And God takes care of every creature, every bird, and even the young lion is taken care of. And the fish in the sea, and the mountains, and the oceans, and so on and so forth. Again, we're saying words here, but if you take the time to stop and say, try this tonight, or try this tomorrow morning. Just take 2 minutes on your phone, time yourself for 2 minutes, and take 2 minutes just to think about the vastness and profoundness of nature, and how many things have to work together for the world to function, for things to happen. And that's the world that is in our consciousness, right? That's what we can see. Then we go to what we can't see. But the scientists are telling us about the galaxies. I mean, we can see some of them. Anybody's been to a luminarium? Anybody been to a luminarium? Yeah, did you go to the space one?
It was in Columbus, at the David Museum.
So if right here on the Beltline is a place called the Luminarium. It's kind of a virtual room you go into, and you get to experience in a virtual reality. They have different things. They have I went to 2 of them. One of them I can't even remember what it was.
Africa.
No, I didn't do the Africa one. It was a kids thing, like a movie, Gewalt, maybe Alice in Wonderland, something like that. Yeah, I think it was an Alice in Wonderland. But the first one we went to was a space. What was fascinating about it is that, I mean, I've been to IMAXs before and planetariums and stuff like that. But what it really kind of did, you felt like you were in, to some extent. It wasn't, a little overrated in my opinion, but you felt the vastness of the cosmos. Like how many millions and billions of light years, and what's going on out there, and these gases that form into these colorful things that are endless light years long, and it's like, wow. And this is all just the physical universe, which, as science tells us now, is ever expanding, whatever that means. I mean, I don't know what that means. Like if you were at the edge of the universe as it's expanding, where's it expanding to? Okay, whatever. I don't want to confuse anybody. I don't want to get a headache today. But whatever that means, right? That's all the physical reality, because it's physical matter there. So we're still in Psuke de Zimra. We're still in the verses of song talking about the vastness of the universe. And then we talk about God's miracles in this universe. The splitting of the sea, the exodus from Egypt, the song of the sea. Like we're beginning to realize that there's more than this, just this universe. And then we move from the universe into the blessings of the Shema, where we begin to talk about the spiritual cosmos, the spiritual realms, the angels, and how the angels, they're infinite angels, and how all of them are created through the name of God, through a shine of God's light. In other words, all of this vastness and this infiniteness, which, by the way, just parenthetically, the idea that the universe is constantly expanding is a clear manifestation of the infinite in the finite, right? A cup of coffee is finite, but it's energized by the infinite. We see that infiniteness and the ability to plant a seed and it reproduces and plant a seed and it reproduces and plant a seed and it reproduces fundamentally, endlessly. And we see that in the ever-expanding universe, which again boggles the mind. But all of this doesn't come from God's essence. I mean, it ultimately comes from God's essence, but its actualization comes from a shine of God's light. It's like almost like, like God was hanging out and said, "Oh, let's make a universe," and the universe came into being. Now, if you take the time to meditate on this and contemplate this, what happens? You begin to move away from being stuck in your finiteness, and you become sensitized to the fact that there's something bigger, there's something greater. And the more you do that, the more this consciousness becomes part of your reality. Now, here's the second point. So far, this makes sense? Okay. Here's the second point. And this is drilling down. I'm going to take 7 or 8 minutes to explain the idea, and then we're going to read it in the text. I want to focus on this idea that all of this existence that God brought into being does not affect God. It doesn't affect him. If I take the time to make a coffee, I took my time and I expended energy into making this coffee. That time is gone. And I'm a different person. I don't mean this too dramatically, but I'm a different person because I made a cup of coffee. I took of my energy and I invested it in making a cup of coffee, let alone if I build a house, let alone if I build a city, let alone if I build a universe, right? There's a lot that has to get output. There's time that I'm putting into it. There's physical energy that I'm putting into it. But God created this universe, the physical and spiritual cosmos. And as we say in the prayer, Atahu Achali Nivra Ha'elam, Atahu Misha Nivra Ha'elam. You're the same God before the world was created. You're the same God after the world was created. You're unchanged. Or as the prophet says, Ani Hashem lo shanisi. I am God, I don't change. I'm unaffected. I'm unaffected by the fact that I created this universe, God says. Which, first of all, that alone is mind-boggling, right? Just to think that God can create a universe and he's unaffected by it. How powerful God is. Powerful in a way that compels us to want to get close to God, not to be frightened from God, although that's part of it as well, as the awe, is coming into a state of God's infinite power humbles us. But it also wants us to get close to God, not to be separated from God. But how could that be? How could it be that God created a universe and he's unaffected by it? Let's go a step further. This universe that God created is constantly being energized by God. God continuously energizes the world every moment, every second. Again, as we say in the prayer and the blessings of the Shema, he renews in his kindness every single day, constantly, the work of creation. So how is it that God is renewing the existence every moment, and yet he's unaffected by it? Is this real? Are we living in a twilight zone? Is this an illusion? So the answer to this question is that God, while God is totally invested in creation and in existence, but in terms of output, God doesn't need to invest himself as a human does in order to keep this world in its state of consciousness. And what it really is that the fact that we see a world is our conscious state. To use an analogy, we'll use an analogy. Analogy, by definition, is not the idea, right? If I'm giving you a parable, I'm giving you an analogy to explain something. The analogy is not the idea. The idea is the idea. But what do you hear? You hear the analogy. And from the analogy, you get to understand some of the depth of the intellectual idea behind the analogy. In other words, from our vantage point, this is a real world. From God's vantage point, it didn't take many energy to make it. So it's not real. To use the language of Kabbalah, God is the true something, and this world is nothing. That's God's vantage point. From our vantage point, this world is something and God is nothing. Not nothing because he's irrelevant, nothing because in comparison to our tangibility, God is intangible. Well, which one is it? Can they both be true? And the answer is yes. It is the fundamental paradox of existence, is that they're both true. It is our limitation that we're not able to see the true reality of existence. We can see it with our intellect. And I'm going to venture out here to say that, and I'm not endorsing anything here, but I've heard this from a number of people, that people who experience psychedelics oftentimes tap into this to this point. Now, there's all kinds of terrible drugs out there. I'm not promoting psychedelics or anything else. One fellow in particular shared a fascinating experience, how he actually used psychedelics for many, many years, but it was a tremendous healing for him in relation to his father, who was I forget what to call it, a person who doesn't have any conscious emotions in relation to others. He wasn't a bad person. He just had like no consciousness that this was his son that he needed to connect with emotionally. A sociopath? But he wasn't like a bad guy. He just was like emotionally disconnected. And growing up as a child of such a person, it's extremely difficult. You need connection with your father. And as a young adolescent, he began to take psychedelics and did it for a number of years. And it actually healed his relationship with his father, because he was able to appreciate that there's only one dimension that he's experiencing in his conscious state. He stopped taking psychedelics after a couple of years, but it was a tremendously healing thing for him. But the idea is that in our conscious state, we see a cup. We see a person. I hear your emotions, I hear your ideas, I hear your life experiences, but I see a person. If I can change the frequency and tap into a different dimension, suddenly I see you differently. I still see your body, but now your emotions are in my face. I'm touching them. I see them. I see the other parts of who you are. I don't just look at a tree and see a tree. I see a different energy going there. And I think there are people that even in natural states have different levels of sensitivity. Different people are able to feel other people's feelings. Empaths, for example, people who are more in tune with nature have a certain sensitivity. It says that the early Hasidic masters, they wouldn't kill a fly because they felt the divine energy sustaining this fly. Like, how can I kill this fly? I mean, that's a very high level, but it exists at different levels in a conscious state. So it's our inability to see the divine energy that energizes everything. But that doesn't change the reality that God is energizing everything. And by the way, it's all part of the divine setup. Again, this is all a setup. The setup is for us to get triggered and navigate through that trigger by developing a deeper consciousness of God and then not getting triggered so much. But we have to invest ourselves in it. This makes sense? So the reality is that, yes, God created a world, but what is the world? It's divine energy. So therefore, God is unaffected. The sun is shining. Did the sun get insulted that I closed the curtains? Didn't get insulted. It didn't even care. It didn't factor in at all. When I open the curtain and I have my plant sitting there and I water the plant grows. The same sun. The sun didn't get invested one way or the other. If the plant was there and it was watered and the curtain was open, the plant grew. If the curtain was closed, the plant didn't grow. The sun is shining. The sun is doing its thing. It's not invested in the rays that are coming from it. So in a sense, God is operating the same way. God is. His energy is manifesting and creating the world every single day, constantly. And in a sense, he's unaffected by the fact that we do or don't recognize him. However, that's only on one dimension. Because otherwise, this whole thing would be a waste of time. The other dimension is that God said, yes, while that is the reality that I'm unaffected, I am choosing to be affected. And this is where the prophet says, if you do good, in tzedakta matitin lo, if you do good, what is he going to give to you? And if you do abundant sin, what's he going to do to you? And what's he going to take from you? In other words, there's on that dimension of God, do good, do bad. It's irrelevant. God is so much higher than that. But there's another dimension that God said, I do care. I want to be bothered by what you're doing. I am choosing to be bothered. I am choosing for there to be good and bad in the world. I'm choosing for there to be morality and immorality. I'm choosing for you to have this choice to choose good over bad. And I'm choosing to be affected by it. Not because I am affected by it, but because I'm choosing to be affected. The analogy I like to give, and I never saw it anywhere, is if you decided to open up the earth in your backyard and put a big piece of glass and watch the battle that's taking place in the ant farm. Right? Do you remember those ant farms? You were able to get it as a kid. And you start watching what's going on. There's a war going on between these ants and those ants and the king ant and the queen ant. I don't know what goes on there. And like you get totally invested in it. By the way, sports is very similar. Fundamentally, it's similar. Like we live down the block from a bar on the corner. And when it's on Shabbos afternoon, when it's football plays Saturday afternoon, right?
Yeah.
So when it's a good Georgia game, like suddenly we're sitting, it's 3:00 in the afternoon. Like there's an earthquake. What's going on? It was a touchdown, or they won the game. Like, who cares? Who cares? This is happening in Athens, Georgia. You're sitting and watching on a digital screen. Like, who cares? You know why you care? Because you decided to care. You decided for it to make a difference in your life, whether this team wins or that team wins. Does it really make a difference? Now, if you bet on the game, then maybe it makes a difference. But then you've chosen for it to make a difference, right? But if you're just a spectator, like, who cares? God chose for it to care. In fact, the greatest pleasure God gets, which is the whole purpose that he created the world, is that when we get triggered and when we want to act on that trigger, we bring God into our consciousness. That is the pleasure God gets. One of the most painful things is to be irrelevant. And one of the most validating things is to be relevant. And God created a world because he wanted to have a relationship. He couldn't have a relationship on his own. So he created a world where he can have a relationship. But how can God have a relationship with himself? So God created this reality that we have a self-consciousness that we are something other than God. And yet we choose to enter into a relationship with God because we recognize that God is inherently within existence, that God is the energy force behind all of existence. And when we do that, and we bring God into our consciousness, God has become relevant. Make sense? Let's read this in the text. We're going to start on page, this one didn't print with page numbers, where it says, this is the intent of the verse, your kingship is kingship over all the worlds. You see that?
Page 5. Yeah.
Page 5 in the middle.
Five, wait, it's, yeah, down here.
No, I want to go back a little further. Sorry. We'll do this quickly here. Let's go back to page before, where it says, on this basis, we can understand the intent of the verse. You see that? I don't have a page number. If you see it,
Page 4.
4 of 8, right in the middle of the page. Okay. I'm going to read the text all the way through. This is the meaning in the verse, in the psalm. And you shall make known to the Son of Man, or humans, his might, his power, and the glory of his kingdom. Which, what does that mean? The glory of his kingdom, that all of them are nullified, they are nothingness, or a more appropriate, they are completely aligned with God. How do we get that alignment? How do they get the alignment? Meaning the angels, how do they get that alignment? Angels are robots. They're spiritual robots. Why? Because they have only one consciousness, and that's God. They understand, they comprehend fully that God's kingdom is the kingdom of all of the worlds. They recognize that the energy force of all of existence is only a ray, a ray of God's name. Not like the soul energizes the body or vivifies the body, where the essence of the energy force of the soul, where does it live? It lives inside the body. Literally, the soul is inside each of us. But God, he is exalted, he is elevated, his essence is beyond the capacity to enclose it. There's no way to contain God. There are two names of God, primary names of God, the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. The witnesses use that name, Je, etc., right? And then there's the name Elokim. What is Elokim? Elokim means judgment. That is God as he is confined in judgment, limitation. The other name of God, Ado and Noi, is actually in Hebrew, the Yud-Kei, Vav-Kei, actually is an acronym for 3 words. Haya, Hova, V'yeh, he was, he is, he will always be, which means transcendent. What does it mean that something was, is, and will always be? It's not defined by time and space. It's transcendent. So God is above, God is transcendent inherently. Belishu niklal. He is without change. Like the verse says, Ani Hashem lo shanisi. In Malachi, it says, I am Hashem, I do not change. The Ein Shum Davar Mechasu Master Negdai, and nothing can cover up, nothing can hide God inherently. God's essence is not hideable. It's not enclothable, it's not hideable, it's too powerful. So how does the world come into existence? It is only a ray of the name, of the glory of God's kingdom alone. This is the energy force of all the worlds. And this is the meaning of the verse. Your kingdom is the kingdom of all the worlds. All of the worlds. Even though, so we have our physical universe, and then we have, this is known as the world of Asiya, the world of action. It's the lower of the 4 primary worlds. Then you have the world of formation, the world of creation, the world of emanation. But those are only general categories. Within each world, whatever I'm about to say, whatever it means, there are infinite worlds, right? Like it says, it says, is there a number to God's How does he translate there? Not troops, but legions. Is there a number to God's legions? From the earth to the sky is a 500-year journey, whatever that means, right? But the idea is that we have these expansivenesses that are beyond comprehension. Notwithstanding that, they are incomparable in relation to God's light. All of these myriads of worlds are incomparable in relation to God's light. God's light, not even to God's essence, to God's light, because God's light, is infinite. Like it's known that if I have, I think a Google is a number, right? That's where, right? Google is a number. I think that's how they came up with the name. It's like infinite, this crazy number of code, right? That's what I meant. 10 to the 100 power. So whatever that is, if I have one of that, right, there's a relationship between the one and the other end of it. It may be this crazy Google number, but there's a relationship because it's one of that. One of 1,000, one of 1,000,000, one of 1,000,000,000, one of 1,000,000,000,000. There's a relationship with the one and the trillion. Let me finish the text and then we'll. But if I have a trillion and you have infinite, there's no comparison. We're not even in the same playing field. So if you have a trillion and I have one, okay, so you have a lot more than I do, a lot more. But we still have a relationship with each other. But if you have infinite and I have a trillion, we're not even on the same playing field. So even though there are myriads upon myriads of worlds, they are insignificant in relationship to the light that energizes them, because the light is infinite. So through that the angels comprehend this. This is the angels who actually get it, right? They're in a state of consciousness. The fact that the angels comprehend this compels them to be robots. That's the outcome. Spiritual robots, because they are completely conscious of God's presence and the infinitesimal size of their existence in relationship to God's infiniteness. They are robots. They can do only what God wants of them. They're completely aligned, completely nullified. They're doing exactly what God wants. Now, our job is to contemplate the angels after we've contemplated God's presence in nature. And what is the result of that? Through contemplating all of the above, with great knowledge, or to use the term we used before, to invest yourself, to truly comprehend this, to meditate on it, not just to listen to a podcast, but to actually internalize it. So what's the outcome? We will move as a result of that to this place of yearning, to this place of running in the recitation of the Shema, when we proclaim Hashem's oneness. And the result of that is the result of that is you will love Hashem your God with all your hearts, which, as we said before, what does that mean? To leave Egypt, to go out of all of the limitations and the boundaries. All of the boundaries are all finite. In other words, the things that hold us back are all finite, and God is infinite. So when I bring the consciousness of an infinite God into my beingness, I'm not limited anymore. I can leave Egypt. I'm no longer stuck in Egypt. As it is in the physical reality, that the physical reality is also finite, that has in it manifestation of the infinite. So my whole desire will be to cleave to God, who is infinite. And this is what it means to leave the exodus from Egypt, to leave the limitations and the boundaries of Egypt. Let me finish up this paragraph so we have this in the bag. When Moses came to Pharaoh the first time, and said, I was sent here by God to to tell you to send the Jews out of Egypt, what did Pharaoh say? Lo yadaiti es Hashem. I don't know God. What name does the Torah use? He uses the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. He says, I know Elokim. As we mentioned before, Elokim is the dimension of God as he's manifest within existence. Right? That's God as he's contracted and manifest. The concealment is Elokim. Pharaoh says, I don't know the transcendent dimension of God. In other words, what is Egypt? Egypt is a place that is not in touch with the transcendent dimension of God. Egypt is a place that only accepts the surface, the shell. Egypt accepts the concealment. Egypt says the concealment is real. I'm trapped by my feelings. I'm trapped by my circumstances. I'm stuck. I'm in Egypt. I'm exiled. I can't get out. But the Torah tells us, the Mishnah says, we have an obligation to leave Egypt. We have an obligation to remember every day the exodus from Egypt, which means we're not trapped. We're not stuck by the concealment. We don't have to buy into Pharaoh's narrative that God's not real. We have the ability to break out of that through this process of meditation, contemplation, bringing God into our consciousness, recognizing God's presence in the physical reality, to whatever extent we can comprehend that God is in the spiritual reality, that God is transcendent and that he's unaffected by all of this existence. This empowers us to not be stuck there. That's why at the end of the Shema, at the end of the third paragraph, it says, Ani Hashem Elokechem. I am Hashem, your God, who took you out of Egypt, because going out of Egypt means we bring a consciousness of Hashem, the transcendent dimension of God, into our finite conscious state. Lachem, see you next week. Any questions?